is great. We're so glad they're here. And when Zach gives me the word, have you given it to me, Zach? Just give me a thumbs up. I'll start the event whenever you tell me. He probably wants to let a few more people
We're
in.
just pushing it there now. Okay, and it looks like we are live now.
So shall I start? Or do you think I
You
should?
can start. Or I would give it a minute.
Okay, I'll wait a minute. Yeah.
And I'm just going to turn my video off and mute myself now.
Okay, great. Thank you. I'll be muting myself while you're talking, but I'll be listening and watching. Just because the first time I did this, I dropped a book and then the screen went to me instead of the people wanted to hear. So I've learned to mute myself, and then I have to remember to unmute myself when I come in at the end. So, oh, it's such a challenge.
The things we learn in a pandemic.
Yeah, we've learned a lot, haven't we? Yeah.
Yeah.
I've certainly learned to appreciate people that I care about. Boy, you just really find out what's important.
Jim, I might ask you to read a couple things
Okay.
at different times. I have a couple passages I had in mind.
All
So
right.
I wanted that greatest generation passage, was one, and there's another. Is there anything that you want in particular? I mean, I had a couple that I looked at, but
I thought I might read if, there's 3 pages about that picture at the Hotel St. George in Brooklyn.
Yeah.
That was one place I thought, because it's about the search for the, the story.
Okay.
Well, I think I'm ready to go. So thank you. I'm so glad that I got this green room time. Hello, everyone. My name's Elaine Petrocelli, and I'm from Book Passage, and I'm so glad you joined us today. This is an event we added because we could not wait. Once we saw this book, Unsinkable, 5 Men and the Indomitable Run of the USS Plunkett, we knew we had to have an event, and we had to have it before Christmas because this is the perfect Christmas present for about everyone on your list. And I'm so glad that Tom Barbash told me about this book because I had missed it. Sometimes I miss books. So that's one of the reasons that I count on my customers and my friends to tell me what's going on, because it's easy to miss something important, and this is truly important. James has written about the 5 men who were on the Plunkett, and this ship that had so much to do with our winning World War II and went through so much. I'm not going to tell you too much about it because I know that Tom and James are going to talk about it, but I just felt after I read it that I knew these 5 men so well, as I saw them starting off in Casablanca and then going to Africa and then going up the coast of Italy and then being bombarded and had every reason to give up and never gave up. And then the ship, after a short time, was refurbished and was an important part of D-Day. So please enjoy this event and know that at bookpassage.com, you will be able to get copies. We are still shipping, although it's a little late to count on getting there for Christmas, unless you do overnight shipping. If you're in the area, come by, but we will ship. And hey, they need something new for New Year's too. So don't miss the Unsinkable. And Tom Barbash is going to be in conversation with James Sullivan today. And I am so appreciative. Tom is almost a member of the Book Passage staff. We call on Tom all the time for advice, for good ideas, to interview authors who are very special to us. And so we feel very lucky that this great writer, novelist, short story writer, nonfiction writer, whose latest book is Dakota Winters, an absolutely fabulous novel that does not appear in the state of Dakota, either north or south, but in that apartment building in New York City. It is a fabulous book. So I hope that you will read it. Many book clubs are reading it too, because there's so much there. So I hope that you will enjoy both of these incredible authors. And I'm going to sit back and relax and listen to Tom talking to James Sullivan. Thank you all.
Thank you, Elaine.
Thanks, Elaine. So for those of you, I guess one thing that Elaine didn't mention is that Jim and I go way back. Jim and I were friends at the Iowa Writers Workshop. And we, over the years, there's almost no one in the world I've talked to more about writing and about books. And I was saying before that you could say that Jim is lucky to have stumbled on this project. I think the Plunkett is so incredibly lucky that Jim discovered them and that Jim is bringing this story to life. It is it's just a masterwork. It is just so good, Jim. I mean, this is the first time I've been able to tell you in detail how much I love this book. And there's something you just said when we were waiting to come on that I wanted you to talk about. And I guess for me, you and I both have backgrounds in both journalism and fiction writing. And so I always say to students, what do you bring to each one? You know, in novel writing, sometimes you need to learn about new things and ask all sorts of questions. But in terms of a nonfiction book, your novelistic skills of bringing these men to life, and your feeling, you know, you said before that the way you put it is that so many of the books about these great military battles are so plot driven, and your fealty, there's so much respect and affection for these men in your book. And I told Jim before that I feel like you were one of them after a while, that I just feel like you spent so much time, you inhabited it with such compassion and empathy and so much of your imagination. But could you talk about, I guess, what you said before? What kind of a book hasn't, you know, the idea that this kind of book hasn't been written enough, the idea of really telling a three-dimensional story about the people in a military story.
Right, right. Well, there are so many great histories of World War II and military histories of the war. And so many of them, I think of the Liberation trilogy by Rick Atkinson and James Fisher's books about the war, the Navy's war in the Pacific. And in so many of these there's an important function here. They're writing history, and it's plot driven. They're writing about these battles. And they have a responsibility to bring characters in and out. And in so many readings of these stories, we'd become introduced to these characters, and they'd come on stage and then they'd disappear. And I always found myself wondering, what were they like as boys, and what happened to them in repose when they were old men? And there was just this great desire to see the arc of an entire life. And so when I began going down this road on Unsinkable, as you say, Tom, I mean, we both know that character is at the heart of any good story. And I thought, you know what, I'm just going to tell the story of 5 men. In fact, I was so insistent that this was about the men that I dreamed about this book, if it ever became a book, with men on the cover, because it was that important to me. And so that was the mission, was to get really close to 5 men, particularly one man in the beginning who was of great interest to me because he's my grandfather's brother. And from there, it just sort of branched out. And I was able to find men, 3 of the men were living. One of the men is living, and I think Jim Phelps is with us tonight in St. Louis, watching us talk about this. But it was important for me to get to know them really well so that I could inhabit the space that they had been in as best I could, and try to give to the reader the same sense of discovery. And
your love of small detail, like I was making little notes of the Christmas menu with the young Tom turkey and the oyster dressing, and what are Harvard beets, by the way? But I kept reading, different things and the details of Edward Burke as a sports star, the songs from the era, the opening of Casablanca, the way you do this really nice thing. Well, you do so many nice things, but one of the things is to capture the era, and especially in the beginning. So where are we at culturally, in the beginning of the war? Also, I was saying to Jim before, another thing that I really admired is so many of the things that are written in retrospect are written with what we know later. And you captured what we didn't know at the moment, the sort of the chaos of war, not knowing, especially sort of moment by moment accounting of the progress. So how did you accomplish that? I imagine that it's a combination of doing the interviews with the men, but you're doing a lot of work. You turned me on to Band of Brothers, the Pacific, and I told Jim that I've been obsessed with World War II during the pandemic because, it was the last time the world went through something altogether. But talk about sort of building the verisimilitude, creating the feeling that we are living in that time.
Right, right. Well, the book began for me with the interviews. Jim Phelps, who's 95 years old today and lives in a small town outside St. Louis, near where he grew up. I connected with him first. And Jim and I just began talking. I had no idea that this was going to be a story. In fact, I'll just tell you a quick anecdote about how this came about. I was on the verge of a family trip to Italy. And my wife vetoed a day trip from Rome to Pompeii. It was too far. The logistics were too much. And I thought, well, let's go closer. And my teenage kids would say, well, there's a beach at Anzio. And Anzio lights up because this is a huge place in my boyhood. This was something that was talked about all the time by my great uncle, Frank Gallagher. And so I began to wonder, was there anybody, I had two great uncles at Anzio, was there anybody still alive who had been on the ship at Anzio, had been on the destroyer, the Plunkett? And I found out from a reunion page that there was, they had their last reunion in 2011. And I called the contact, and this man told me that, yes, there was a man who's still living, who was on the ship at Anzio. His name's Jim Phelps, nice fella. I gave him a call on his cell phone, of all things. He's 92 years old. I catch him at a home show, in St. Louis, which I thought was great. He's out like shopping tile for a new backsplash or something. He's not going to give up. He is going. And so we start talking, and he talks to me about the Plunkett. And I'm asking him questions about the Plunkett, and he's going on, but he's at a home show, right? And he says, Jim, I'd love to talk to you. Can you call me back tomorrow at home? And I said, I'd love to. And before I let you go, I said, can I tell you the name of my great uncle? And I told him his name, John J. Gallagher. And there's this silence on the other end of the phone. And I'm thinking, this man is rummaging through his memory now. 265 sailors. He does not want to disappoint me, right? And say, no, I don't remember him. And then I realized the calls drop. I look at my phone and I think the calls dropped, but it hasn't dropped because Jim is in shock on the other end of the line. And his voice comes back to me. And in his voice, there's a smile as big as the moon. And he says, Johnny Gallagher was a very good buddy of mine. And so right there, I just called to try to find out, to connect with someone, who'd been on the ship, and there's Jim Phelps. And I knew that something was going to happen. Tom, I know I didn't answer your question exactly.
No, but this is a better thing, Jim. And this is where I do want to get to that, but this is so much more central to it because you and I were talking all the way through this. I mean, you told me right after you'd had this conversation, and that idea, there's something, the success of the book has so much to do with what's coming across now in your answer to me, which is this love of this miracle that there are people that are still alive that can tell this story and that they're going to tell it to you. And I think there's this way in which you followed this story with such great enthusiasm and pathos. And I do want to hear about that, like the sort of the detective work of building, and then the joy of finding out, and then because you re-inhabit some really sad moments, just the kind of emotional journey of this discovery process you went through.
Right. Yeah. I mean, it is. The discovery process is the exhilarating part of it, right? It's why we get up in the morning and sit down and look at that page, or we're doing all of our research on the side, and then we come to it. We discover these things, and it's just exhilarating. It's what's sustaining about writing. And you try to build something in a story that doesn't put it all in there, right? Because the reader's got to discover something. So you put in just enough so that the reader has to come. Remember Frank Conroy at the workshop used to describe that rainbow and how it was the responsibility of a writer to only go halfway over the rainbow, because the readers got to journey up there. The readers got to do that work to meet you halfway in the middle so that you can participate in the discovery. And so yeah, I mean, this was such an exhilarating thing for me over the last 3.5, 4 years to wake up to this, to discover this. And that's what I try to do, to build these pieces. And there are so many disparate pieces. It's funny, Tom, you mentioned that, I think, I'm sure I talked to you within days, if not hours, of my first connection to Jim Phelps. And then you and I had that conversation. I was out visiting Jim Phelps, and Jim has this room in his house that is a shrine to the Plunkett. There's the painting on the wall. There are all of his pictures and his photo albums and all the memorabilia. I mean, that sustains him today. And there was this one party picture on the wall.
Can you read from that? Yeah.
The Hotel St. George, and I called you right after I had seen that because I thought it was just brilliant. Yeah, I can read a little bit if you'd like.
Yeah, that's perfect. Yeah, if you could do that.
All right, good. I've got it here on screen, so I'll just read off this. It's just 3 pages, and I think the only setup is to know that that I had seen this picture. Most of Unsinkable takes place back in the day. It's we are with these men back during the war. But on a couple of different occasions, I sort of come into the present because there's something to be learned about these men today that we kind of need to know back in the day. And so I was visiting Jim Phelps. We spent a lot of time together, and Jim brought me into this room, and I was attracted immediately to this framed picture he had on the wall in his study. And it's this party picture at the Hotel St. George. Hundreds of men in this black and white photo, the kinds of photos that we don't take anymore as a people, but they did then. And it was in the middle of this great ship's party. It was March 19th, 1943.
There it is.
Have you got that picture there? It is. It's on that. Yeah, it's in the book, and it's on the website too. And you can blow it up. I dwelled in that picture for hours. But here's the little bit that I wrote about that. Right after I had seen it. So several months before that first German fighter plane swept out of the low-lying Sicilian hills and strafed Plunkett, months before they bore down on the Germans at Salerno, before the conflagration of the Newfoundland, before the rending of the Buck and the calamity at Anzio, more than 200 of the Charlie P's sailors and their dates and families crowded the rooftop ballroom for a ship's party at the Hotel St. George in Brooklyn. Tall, narrow windows flanked the sides of the room, rising from waist height to 15 feet, which was where the ceiling began to arch in a vault. Ornate Corinthian sconces glowed off the walls, and one tall, narrow mirror at the rear reflected the backs of the enlisted men's dress blues. The photographer captured them in a surge of attention, as if all had been up and dancing and called to face the bandstand. If you look closely enough, you can hear drummer Gene Krupa in the near distance, and Harry James blowing the trumpet, rolling out the same notes louder and louder, Krupa urging him on. And then the segue to Benny Goodman, purling notes on the clarinet as limpid as brook water, piping all the way up to a magnificent high C before Jess Tracy grabs the baton and dances over the ivories all the way to his own high C. It's one of those pictures you could dwell in for an hour or two, drifting from personality to personality, each a story in his or her own right, some more dramatic than others by the looks on their faces. The women in their fantastic hats and hairdos, their corsages and ribbons, the men mostly in uniform, all of them exuberant and so engrossed in this one moment memorialized in a picture. There is the elegantly beautiful woman in pearls and a fur stole and shoulder-length hair, standing a sister's distance from an enlisted man beside her, an older couple behind them, another young couple who've forsaken the lens for each other. The enlisted man turned in profile to gaze upon her. She is facing the camera, but has swerved her eyes up at him, lips pursed. The couples cheek to cheek, the enlisted man who looks no more than 14 years old. Some of the women were USO girls recruited for the party and minded by chaperones. You can see as much in their tentative regard for dates who seem altogether more bullish on their prospects for the evening. There was a war going on outside of this ballroom in this borough, and many of the men in this picture, countless dozens, would be dead within the year. But they were alive as any of us can be for a flash that evening at the Hotel St. George. The picture's in black and white, of course. In fact, it's hard to believe life was lived in color back then, so conditioned are we to seeing it in black and white. It's almost as if the world only brightened in color in complication with Vietnam and the advent of the baby boomers. Before then, everything was black or white, this or that, good or bad. It was 2 good nights in a row for Irving Gephardt, who, after getting 2 teeth filled at the dentist the previous afternoon, had been out to see Benny Goodman on Liberty. Afterward, he'd met a bunch of the men from Plunkett at Rogers Corner across from Madison Square Garden and drank until it was only time to get back to the ship for 6 a.m. In the photo, he stands shoulder to shoulder with his USO girl date and leans his head slightly toward her, a gesture she isn't returning. 1 or 2 sailors and dates away, there's Jim Phelps, not shoulder to shoulder with another USO girl, but behind her and closer to the table he sat up from for the picture because he had not been out on the floor dancing. Edward J. Burke, the captain, is standing front and center, as was customary for the ship's captain. And Dutch Heisler is 5 places to Burke's right with a white carnation pinned to the left breast of his uniform and his wife Ginny on his left arm. On this March night of 1943, Ken Brown is 3 rows behind Burke and slightly to the right. I'd never seen this picture before and didn't know it existed until I'd walked into a room in Jim Phelps's house where he'd memorialized the Plunkett. I'd stood a long while rummaging among the hundreds of faces and found another young man toward the front of the crowd, 3 deep from the first row, leaning in from behind a woman with an awesome crest of permed hair, his hand draped over the shoulder of a young woman nowhere near as tentative as Gephardt's. His hair was up and off his forehead, and his eyes were bright with the night. And there was that gap in John Gallagher's teeth, and so much surprise in his face, because he's looking across the stretch of this ballroom at a camera, but he's looking across the decades too. Aha, you found me. So there's a picture.
Isn't there's well, first of all, it's wonderful writing. And secondly, that sense of looking at people who don't know, you know what they're heading into and they don't know, you know, that kind of, that's always amazing to me, that quality, and it has it. Do you have, who are you, were you talking to Jim? You have a description in the book of talking to someone on the phone and then imagine their voice communicating during the war. Like it was this feeling that something that you'd mythologized had come to life, you know,
right?
That passage, that
yeah.
feeling. And it's funny because I had a similar weird thing is that I have in my book, I have this true story about John Lennon and Captain Hank Halstead on this boat. And I dialed up this number not thinking I would get it. And the person who answered the phone happened to be Hank Halstead. And I had so mythologized that story. And then we ended up talking for 2 hours. But it's weird when you have such, because you've lived with this person in your imagination and then they're actually a living, breathing human being. It's almost overwhelming, right?
It is. It is, and it's, and I think I know the place you were talking about, and it is like you with those connections to those people. It's just, you know, it's one of the byproducts of doing what we do. I mean, it's just an exhilarating thing to have happen. But I was one day, I was driving in my car. I'd been with my daughter and my wife down to visit a college. Vivian was getting ready to go away, and we'd been to visit a college. And I was coming back. We were driving back. It was just after dark. And I was on the interstate in New Hampshire. We're driving north, and I've got the phone on the grill of my car, and the phone lights up, and it's Ken Brown calling me. And in the several years that I talked to all these men, you know, you never let a call like that go to voicemail, you know, because when I would pick up the phone, I by this time, and I had to be careful that I didn't mythologize these men and make them something they weren't, because they were as human as any of us are. But it is difficult to resist the impulse to put these men on a pedestal. And sometimes, you know, when I hear their voices, it's almost as if what it is that's put them on a pedestal, it's like a statue giving voice to what's put them on that pedestal, you know? I mean, it is. They exist for me as these young men who are, Jim Phelps is 17 and 18 years old on the Plunkett doing what he had done. And Ken Brown is 23 years old. And Jack Simpson is 23 years old. And these guys that I'm talking to today, it was hard sometimes to to realize that they were the same person, that, you know, that were the heroes in these story, in the story.
Yeah, but the other thing that you do, Jim, that I love is that you've got this reverence from a distance, and then when you come in as you've got reverence for them. But when you're writing moment by moment, you almost know the gossip. Like, you know, this person was kidded a lot because, you know, because his team lost every game. You know the gossip about the guy who smelled so much they called him the scrounge. You know, it's like that's the thing is that you've done so many interviews, and in when you're in there, nobody is a hero yet, and you know the interplay, right? You know, and how they're treating one another, and the grit of it.
Right.
So that was something you consciously tried to do? So.
Well, yeah, I mean, I looked for those details of resonance, and I found them in so many places. The scuttlebutt is that great Navy term.
Yeah.
You'll know that. So you listen for that, and I listened to that in the interviews, and I found some great sources too. I mean, it was part of the fun of this whole project was the discovery of all these sources, and I found this great unpublished memoir by another sailor from Fall River, Massachusetts, named Jim Mcmanus. And Jim had written as an older man, I think he was in his 80s, he wrote My Journal, this 80-page account of his 20 years in the Navy. And there was a lot of detail in there. And that bit, it was Jim who had to go up to that man who wasn't taking a shower and say, you know, so I borrowed.
Did he say, it's like, how many baths did you take before the war? He's like, oh, once a week, right? Yeah. So.
Every Saturday night I took a bath.
And they even told him about changing his underwear too.
That's right. They had to talk
I think
about
there was an old myth my dad told me that like the joke was, did you change your underwear? Yeah, I changed it. They basically turned it inside out. Yeah, that was changing your underwear for some of these guys. But yeah,
that's right. Yeah, they had to wash it all on seawater and dried stiff as a board. And but yeah, I mean, finding those things, you know, they were the building blocks. And the more you find them, and it was important to me. I think there are 500 source notes in the back. I wanted to acknowledge the sources on all that, because some of it even seems to me too unreal to be true. And so it was important to source that.
I have this quote I wanted to just ask you about, and it's about, you know, because you talked about lionizing that generation, and it said so much had been made of his generation, the so-called greatest generation, that it was hard now to reference them without genuflection or to say anything about them that didn't tend towards hyperbole. Our regard for them was more religious than grounded. We were led to believe they'd been steeled by the Depression and were capable of withstanding more hardship than baby boomers or any subsequent generation. We rued the possibility of war in our time because the millennials were incapable of switching gears from joysticks to rifles, and because for so many other reasons, their zombie-like regard for their phones, their cosseted childhoods, we found them wanting. To believe this is to deny how woefully unprepared for war we were in 1941, and to ignore what the Brits made of us when we first waded into battle in North Africa. Do you want to talk about that, the misconception, you know, of are you saying in essence that by turning them into heroes, they're even sort of more heroic than we've turned them into, because that assumes that there were these majestic people going in, but they were just unprepared kids, right? So.
Right. Yeah. I mean, I think if you ask 10 people on the street, you know, the greatest generation, there's this idea that because they grew up during the Depression and suffered all that hardship, that they were poised and ready for, you know, to take on the challenge of fighting that war. But that's not what the historical record says. You know, there was one general who called the young men of that generation mollycoddled, or it might have been Roosevelt who used that term. And Jim Mcmanus, in his unpublished memoir, says, he was at boot camp, and, you know, there were 18-year-old kids, and they're crying because they're away from home. And he says, I've never heard so many wimps, was the word he used. I think it was a word he borrowed from our time, but that was how he described it. So I think that those men who became the greatest generation, they didn't start out that way. They were forged by that war, and that's why we look back.
Yeah, and I think you know, some of the other things that have been done about the war, Band of Brothers in the Pacific, we had a sense of that too. I wanted to ask you about that, just sort of because of the time, you're an intense observer, you know, and a very smart observer of what's happening right now, and you've been living in that time. And I just think about what's happened with sheltering in place and the lockdowns is it's a call to sacrifice. and these men were called to sacrifice, and the other thing too, you and I talked about, is the humility, the idea that you have people at the end of the book who are such heroes, who are regretting the lives they didn't save, regretting your uncle's life, that wasn't saved. And this tendency with a certain leader of our country, to not take responsibility for or be apologetic for anything. I wouldn't have changed anything. I take no responsibility. Like the contrast of what we all should do as we come together as a nation, and what we're failing to do, I guess.
Right. Yeah, I mean, back then, and it's what's remarkable too about World War II, in the same way that we misconstrue the caliber or the mettle of the men going into the war, we also forget that America was very ambivalent about going into the war in the first place. I mean, there was an organization called America First,
Yep.
that was trying to keep us out of it. I mean, Roosevelt knew deep down we had to get into this thing, but he knew that he needed the country behind him. He knew that he had to wait.
Well, yeah, and from reading, we came close. I mean, we needed Pearl Harbor, but not only that, but Germany declared war, and Roosevelt was, okay, I can do it now. And he might not, right? I mean, it wasn't a slam dunk that he could have done it. So
No. I mean, and that was his brilliance. I mean, he waited all of these little things, like the Reuben James was a destroyer that was sunk, and we did not declare war after that. He knew, he read the electorate, and he knew, and he was up against a lot of stuff. There's this other thing that I've thought about during the pandemic too, because the U-boats, they called them, they prowled the East Coast of the United States in 1940 and 41, and they were picking off our merchant vessels right and left. You could see them from Miami Beach. You could see these merchant vessels blowing up and going down. And all along the Eastern Seaboard, there was a reluctance to dim the lights. They would not respect these dim light ordinances because it was bad for businesses. So the cities were lit, the merchant vessels are going by, and they're perfectly silhouetted. So the U-boats had easy pickings, and the German U-boat commanders called it the happy time because they took us down. So Roosevelt really had his work cut out for him. And by the time of Pearl Harbor, we were ready to go, but we might have been ready a little bit sooner.
Yeah. So Jim, I know book passage audiences, and one thing about them that I think Elaine will agree with, there are a lot of intense readers, but there are a lot of writers among the people, and there's a lot of people who think they want to know how you did this, essentially how you came from doing all this research of something that happened way before your lifetime and brought it vividly to life. I mean, that can be an ambition, but what are some of the nuts and bolts things that you thought about, and were there ever times where you looked at it and you thought, oh, this is too heavily researched, this has too much quotes, this isn't coming to life? Like, what sort of things did you have to do in order to have it read the way it does now?
Well, in the beginning, it was, I had no plans. I mean, it's 16 years since between from this book to my last book. And I went into this not thinking that it was going to be a book for publication. I was doing these things with my kids, and we go on these trips in April, and I tell them family stories, and I write up these little, like I wrote this story, we went to visit a battlefield, Revolutionary War battlefield, and I wrote this little thing up. And then I had a great grandfather in a sanitarium. He died in Saranac, and I wrote this little thing. And so I started this that way. And I remember going out to this local bookstore that had this you could give them a PDF file, and they would make a book out of it. So that's what I was going to do with this in the beginning, right? I was just going to write this thing up because it was the most urgent thing that I had, in my, it became the most urgent thing I had to do. And I didn't know this in the beginning. And so, I mean, directly to your point, I think you're, as writers, I mean, what we're obliged to do is to find out what we want to exist most in the world and do that. In this thing, in the beginning, I didn't know that it was that. But after I began talking to Jim Phelps and Ken Brown and Jack Simpson, I realized that, this is, I don't really have a choice in this now. I have to run with this and have this story remembered the way they remember it, and don't let it drift over the horizon. So it's the urgency. That's the thing.
Yeah, and to write, to honor that place and to trust it too. Is there someone, one of the men watches the Ken Burns Vietnam series, and it makes him think back and think about can you talk about that? Have some sort of regrets, wasn't it,
Yeah.
or a different comprehension of his own experience? Who was
Sure,
that?
that was Ken Brown, and
Yeah.
Ken Brown was he was the gunnery officer on Plunkett, and the gunnery officer was the man who he worked out of the gun control fire director. This is a small compartment shaped like a bread box at the highest part of the ship, and he coordinated the gun's battery. There were 4 or 5 inch guns running up and down the spine of the ship, and that's what he coordinated with gun captains. So this is his job. He's 23 years old. He's got all of the responsibility of Plunkett's offensive capabilities in his hands, a ton of responsibility. And so Ken is an older man. Now he also appoints all of the men who work in the guns, the 20 millimeter guns. Plunkett had 6 of them. And he told me one day that, yeah, I appointed your great uncle. I put him on a 20 millimeter gun because he was 26 years old and he was older and more mature. And I thought he could handle it. And then toward the end of the life, and it was this really curious thing that happened. I visited with Ken over 2 long weekends on 2 different occasions. And there would be a moment, we'd be drinking whiskey. We'd be sitting there with a tumbler of whiskey. And I remember
How surprising, Jim, you drinking whiskey? I'm shocked.
Yeah, well, Ken had very, very good whiskey. And so, and he says, he's looking at his tumbler one day and he says, Jim, you would be within your rights to look at me today and say, Brown, what the hell were you doing back then? You should have been training these men more. Instead, you're out at some gin mill, having another drink. You could have been trained. And I had no conception of that. I couldn't believe, because he had done so much right. But Ken was interesting in that he was more haunted and plagued by the things he had not done right. And he was an incredibly reflective man. He's 95 years old at this time, 96 and 97, but he had not stopped. He had not stopped deliberating and thinking back and wondering how he might have done better. And he hadn't thought about, he hadn't given up on trying to make things better. I mean, he was walking around, we go out to breakfast. I remember looking at his walker. He's got a Sierra Club sticker over, one of the crossbars on his walker, because he had great concerns about the environment and the harm that was being done to the planet. So he was not giving up. He was going down, he was not going gentle into that good night. And so he was just, and that made him all, going back to something we were talking about earlier. So often we think of these men in one dimension, they're heroes and they are consistently one way. They don't have any regrets. But Ken was, it's a testament to his great humanity that he understood that what he had accomplished on Plunkett was remarkable. But at the same time, he realized that some of the things that he had done on Plunkett were wrong, and he just could never reconcile them, the two. He had to hold them both at the same time. And I thought that was just a remarkable thing for a 97-year-old man to be capable of.
I was wondering, along with that, what are maybe 2 or 3 other things that were that came to you as sort of startling truths about either the war or these men? Because you don't come to this without knowledge. You're a World War II buff. I mean, a Vietnam War buff. I mean, so what are some things that really took you by surprise, that you discovered? You thought, that's not at all what I would have thought.
Well, I think the most powerful experience that I came away from with this book was the recognition of, I mean, if there's a shared truth, right? This is what we're trying to do with the story is illuminate some sort of a shared truth, and it wasn't anything that I was deliberately looking for, but it was something that came to me and that struck me at the most profound levels, because in the United States, we have this idea of the solitary hero. We celebrate the cowboy and we celebrate the mountain man and these great individuals, right? And we think that we celebrate these individuals more than we celebrate ourselves together as a tribe. And but I think we're wrong about that. I think that what we do celebrate more is the act of coming together, right? It's a band of brothers, right? And think about, we've all probably seen the Queen's Gambit now, right? And remember that moment toward the end, Beth is toe to toe with Borkov in Moscow, right? And she is a solitary hero. But in her moment of need, you know, who calls in but Benny? And this guy, it's her team in the States. And we get that great moment when you see Beth, there's Benny, and then the camera pans, and there's Beltic, and there's all of our team, and they come together, you know, and that was how we overcame it. You know, it's that band of brothers thing. And I think that's what I found out, you know, was true about the Plunkett too. I mean, you had 250 men on this ship, which is, you know, I mean, on a battleship, there were 10 times as many men, but on a destroyer, you know, there is that number, I think it's called Dunbar's number, and social anthropologists say that you know, 200 men is the maximum number with whom we can enjoy stable social relationships. And so you've got these guys, these destroyermen that had come together on this ship, and they had the shared experience of this time on a ship together, and then they had the shared experience of the war, and then they had the shared experience of Anzio when this 550-pound bomb hit the ship, and it killed a number of them, 53 of them, and it wounded so many more, but it galvanized them. You know, in that furnace, they were galvanized, and that forged a remarkable fidelity that I have just never encountered before. And it's a privilege to see it, to see that kind of fidelity in men like Ken Brown and Jim Feltz and Jack Simpson. And I think, you know, what an experience to have. And the war ends, and these guys are gone from each other. They go on with the rest of their lives, and they lose touch, but they've never lost grip. And that thing just always profoundly and deeply moved me.
It makes me, I had another question which has to do with just the unique environment of a ship, of being, because there's having the group of 200 people, but there's also being out at sea and you know, disconnected, and you've got the ocean, and then you've got, and your knowledge of things, you know, there's this great detail you said about the orange light, which is an explosion, but it's your own ammunition which creates the kind of orange light. But I wondered, because you know, one of the things I do, and I talk with other writers about it, is there's a kind of method acting that you do, that you inhabit that space. And I'm wondering if you, in your mind, had to understand the choreography of the ship. Like you talk about the different roles the gunner do, and where everybody is. Did you have dreams where you're walking around the ship and you're going, you know, like just to get a sense of it? How do you go about doing that sense of, and then, you know, which also incorporates, I guess you described, isn't it? That Neptune would take the ship, you know, you were really being mythical. And by the way, I mean, there's another section. There's a lot of poetry in your writing about the ship and about the battles, you know. But where is that headspace in the moment that you're writing those? Are you right there in that scene?
Right. Well, I tried to get as close as I can. I remember Jim Feltz told me when he was in the fire room when the bomb hit. And Jim said the first thing he felt, it was as if something had reached up from down below and just pulled that ship down. And he had no idea how far they were going to plunge. It must have been like in an eternity. I mean, Jim and I have talked about that so many times. I ask him the same question over and over again, because every time he asks a question, sometimes another detail leaks out. And so
you're writing while you're asking the questions, right?
Right.
You're sitting there and you're like, oh, this is good. Can I ask you like 3 more right here? So, yeah.
That's having a little bit of newspaper reporter background helps in that regard.
And novelist's background too. So
yeah, trying to inhabit that space, and so a lot of it did come from my talk. I don't know how many hours and hours and hours Jim and I have talked, and Ken and I talked, and Jack talked. But you know, I spent a lot of time on the Cass and Young, which is a World War II era destroyer. And those guys were great. It's a museum ship in Boston's Navy Yard. And I got down into that fire room. And so Jim, you know, I would take my notes from my talks with Jim, and I'd go down into the fire room with this great guy, Sam Goodwin at the Cass and Young. And he would walk me through how they would light the boilers and when they would put the burner tips in, and where the annunciator, where they'd hear the call from the bridge, you know, for full speed or flank speed. So, you know, I'm down there and I'm just taking notes all over the place and trying to imagine what it was that Jim had told me, or, you know, I'm up in the gun director sitting up where Ken had sat, and feeling that space and trying to inhabit it. And so that was what I did for 3.5 years. I tried to live in their world as best I could.
And you did, yeah. So Jim, I wanted you to read what I was telling you before. It's a really extraordinary and difficult scene. And this is on page 203. And it's the section where Jack Simpson has to use the knife. Do you mind reading that section?
That's a hard one. I know. Yeah, I will. I'll read that that little bit there. Let me see. Do you know, Tom, where to start there?
Yeah, I think it's, well, you could say the grace of God would be called for now because there was no way Burke was going to indulge the luxury of further attempts at identification. So
Right. Okay.
the page.
Okay.
But just to give the setup, maybe. I mean, it's
Oh,
just.
yeah. Okay. Yeah, sure. So the setup is the another destroyer. In fact, Jack Simpson had been on the bridge and saw this destroyer hit. I think they were in Salerno, in the Gulf of Salerno, and a destroyer was about to escort a convoy back to North Africa. In an E-boat, which is kind of a small Italian PT-like boat, it got them with a torpedo. It may have been a U-boat. The historical record's not clear on that. But anyway, this ship went down in less than a minute with 202 officers and men. And Jack saw that. He was on the bridge and he saw the ship hit. He saw it go down. 3 days later, the Plunkett is out patrolling a sector, and they come upon 7 bodies that are floating in the water. And the bodies are completely naked. The men have bloated out of their clothes, and it's very, they've realized that these are men off the Rowan. They didn't go down with the ship, but they escaped and floated free, and they were found. And so now, because Jack Simpson is the ship's first lieutenant, it's his job to get in one of the Plunkett's whale boats or gigs, the 2 boats that hang from davits on the side of the ship and that they used to go down. So he goes down and they retrieve these men, these 7 men, and they've got to sit. And you had to wonder, the Plunkett had to go off and finish its patrol. So Jack and his crew had these 7 men. They couldn't identify them, and they're in the boat. The Plunkett comes back. They bring them up, and now they've got to bury them. And so they didn't have a chaplain on the ship, but Jack was from Atlanta, and I always love the idea that, well, he's a Southerner, he must know the Bible. So they recruited him to do what he had to do, and he always had to do the toughest stuff because he was first lieutenant, including what he does here. And this is where we begin here. The grace of God would be called for now. The 7 men are on the fantail of the Plunkett. They're naked, they're bloated, they have to prepare them for burial. The grace of God would be called for now because there was no way Captain Burke was going to indulge the liberty of the luxury of further attempts at identification. Plunkett didn't have a chaplain on board, but one of the ship's reserve officers was a Southerner, and he had a Bible. They retrieved canvas shrouds and 52-pound shells to weigh the men down. There was some discussion about what to do next, for the dead men had to be relieved of the gas, but nobody wanted to do it. So Jack Simpson, the Southerner, did it because he was also first lieutenant. Jack didn't have a Navy issue knife, but he had fashioned one for himself in the ship's engine rooms, grinding one of the files until it was white hot, dunking it in colder water to set the shape, then grinding and dunking again until he got it the way he wanted it. Jack knelt before the first bloated sailor and slipped his blade into the man's gut, venting gas so wretched that a sympathetic ventilation of his own gut was now a possibility. The first lieutenant stood and turned away from the body a moment, collecting himself. The med sparkled sunlight off swells that made for a head of land that was no sanctuary. It wasn't enough to address only the gut. Each lobe of the lungs must be vented. It was the thing you wanted done quickly, but hurrying such enterprise would be tantamount to blasphemy, for this was the end of a man who had a mother out in the world, perhaps, or a wife or a child. He angled the tip of his blade at the rib cage between the armpit and the nipple, and then leaned on the hilt to pierce the skin. Surprisingly, it took very little pressure to get into the space between the lining of the lung and the lung itself. He could almost feel a pop at the entry, and there was an audible rush of air as the gas was exhausted. There were prayers stirring within Jack as he conducted this ministration, psalms, susurrating from his lips at barely discernible volume and with no need for articulation. This was between Jack and the man for whom he had to do this. The man deflated to a semblance of his former self, and the pharmacist's mates negotiated the remains into a canvas sack. The gunner's mates contributed 2 50-pound shells per canvas. So that is how they prepared the men for burial.
It's astonishing. And that was when we were talking about before about the kind of sacrifice of who would possibly want to do that, and how many people would have run from that task. But what is it inside someone that enables them to do something like that? Is it love? Is it courage? What is it?
I think it's the work. This is something that Jim Phelps used to talk about all the time, because I would ask him, Tom, just what you're asking me. I'd say, Jim, how did you do what you did? When you were on the midship repair party and there were bombs hitting all around, how did you jump aboard the Newfoundland when it was burning and try to save that hospital ship and all the supplies? And Jim, when that bomb hit at Anzio, he popped out of that fire room because his entire midship repair party, they were all dead. He had left that party just 2 weeks before Anzio. And now all of those guys are gone and no one is fighting the fire. And Jim jumps out of the fire room and he's alone on this inferno trying to save his ship. And I would ask, where do you get whatever it takes to do that? And what Jim always said was, he says, it was the job. That was my job. You just did your job. You did it was work. And I always thought that was just so remarkable that was how they processed this stuff, because how else could you get anything done if you didn't try to make this workaday stuff? They talked about it with metaphors of employment and of sports. We're a team and this is the work we do. These guys are in the midst of the most cataclysmic event of the 20th century. And this was how they got through it, by making it as ordinary as they could.
How much did they know about the greater war around them? I mean, how closely were they following the different theaters, like the Pacific, or other, because war is happening everywhere, in the world at that point, and did they gauge how we were doing overall? Were they tunneled into the task ahead? How were they listening constantly to BBC broadcasts and exchanging news to each other?
Well, they were getting a lot of news out of the Radio Shack. Sailors had that luxury. They had a communication network on the ship. And so it was.
My dad did. I know that. Yeah.
That's right. Your father was a junior officer on the battleship Texas at Omaha Beach. And he did that. That was his work, right? Yeah. So, that Radio Shack was a great source. And these guys would get off the ship at Liberty. And so they were, I read a number of unpublished diaries, and these guys were tuned in. They knew what was going on in the world, and they knew just how perilous it all was. They didn't know the sense of it. Like Jim Phelps was writing in his diary, he is going into Omaha Beach, right? He's going in on Normandy. They've got the film director, John Ford, who made all those great movies. Can you
talk about that, Jim? Because I think people might not know that, but yeah.
Yeah. So Omaha Beach, when Jim was writing about Omaha Beach, he didn't know that he was going into Omaha Beach and that it was D-Day, and the Plunkett was so close. Well, I'll back up because it is sort of an interesting story about John Ford. He came on the ship in I think at the Scapa Flow in Scotland, which is where Plunkett was right before D-Day. And when the Plunkett's crew saw John Ford coming aboard, this legendary film director, they know this was the guy who did How Green Was My Valley and The Informer and all these great movies. They knew they were going into something significant. And he comes aboard and he's got all of his cameras and these special Coast Guard photographers. So they've got Ford now. And so they're in convoy. And they are going in. It's the morning, and we can all picture now, because of Saving Private Ryan, right? What it was like for those guys in the landing craft. And
Plunkett, 5 who came back, right? Yeah. So.
That's right, 5 who came back. Yeah, and so Plunkett is right on the edge of those landing craft as they are going in. They're escorting them right up as close as they can to provide fire support, bombardment in the shore. And Plunkett got so close to to the shore at Omaha Beach, and a boat scraped its hull in the sand, and John Ford is on the bridge with the captain, and he wants to get closer for his cameras, right? And you know, all hell is breaking loose because it's D-Day. It's the first H hour, and Ford turns to the captain and he says, "Can you get us closer?" You know, and the captain says, "Yeah, I can get you closer. I can put you in that whaleboat over there, and we'll lower you, and you can row yourself right up onto the sand." And so that was Plunkett on D-Day, right up close.
Yeah. Can you talk a little bit about the end of the book, you know, and sort of, it's after we've seen all that these men have been through, and then figuring out how do you want to bring this to a close, you know, because but just talk a little bit about what you thought it might be, and how you knew this was right.
Well, the natural end to the story, I think, was, you know, these men, I was reading some World War II era poetry during the last stages of writing this book. And there's this beautiful poem by a poet named George Oppen, who won the Pulitzer Prize for this poem. And there's a passage in there, and it's just 3 simple lines. And I put it in the last chapter of the book. You know, he says, and this was a World War II soldier writing after the fact. And he says that I cannot, as an older man thinking back, I cannot even now altogether disengage myself from those men. So these men in the 1980s now, you know, they're at the end of their working lives, and there's less to look forward to and so much to look back over. And so they began to come together in these reunions. I was talking earlier about the fidelity, and this was the remarkable thing. They would spend all they had every single year, starting in 1982, to come together and be with each other again. And these were the most important people in their lives. I mean, these 250 men, so many of them would come back together. And there's this one great scene where there's a chief, chief petty officer named Bechtold. He was the man who, after the bomb had hit, he went down into this inferno and figured out how to open these water lines. And Ken would tell this story about Bechtold's first reunion back. They all knew what Bechtold had done on that ship. He had saved the ship. So many of them had saved the ship, but they knew Bechtold's story. And Ken said, you know, he came into us. We had got to the ballroom ahead of him, and he came walking through the door, and he was just weeping profusely. And Ken said, of course, I started weeping, and they were all weeping, because it's this recognition once again of this fidelity that they had. They had been through the shared experience of fire, and so the book moves in that last chapter toward this, and eventually into Anzio, where John Gallagher remains to this day. So
I think we're going to wind up. But Jim, I was thinking it. Just like you and I reminisce about our days at the drinking whiskey and beers at the Fox Head, right? So.
That's right. That's right. 30 years ago, yeah, we cry when we.
A little bit, I do. It is such to wind this up, because I know we have to, but obviously you can see that the two of us can talk forever, and often do. It is absolutely the ideal Christmas, Hanukkah, everything, birthday, whatever you want, present this year. And also do buy it from Book Passage, and come shop at Book Passage if you want to make sure that you get it before Christmas Day. And Jim, I'm just so happy for you. And you know, the book, by the way, it was stripped on the Wall Street Journal opinion page, front of the art. Anything else new? I guess anyway, great things are happening everywhere.
Yeah, it's interesting to watch it all. So. Yeah, I'm glad for the men that they have this.
Yeah, and it's perfect time to be reading about this as well. Elaine, do you want to come in?
Yes, my texts have been lighting up while you two have been talking, from people telling me how much they're enjoying this event, and I'm so glad that we had the privilege of producing it. And Jim, what a book! I am just so impressed, and I can think of about 20 people on my list who I think I'm going to give a second book to, because although I already sent them something else, this is the book they need. For those of you in the audience who are Book Passage supporters, We are so grateful to you. Your support this year has kept us in business, both financially and with your gift certificates and all the shopping you have done, both at bookpassage.com and at our 2 stores in Corte Madera and at the San Francisco Ferry Building. And it's not too late to get a great Christmas gift. And one of the things that I'd like to suggest is we have something called the Aunt Lydia Book Club, which sounds weird, but it's basically a personal book club. And you tell us what this person loves, and we will send them a book from you once a month or once every other month. And we only charge you as we send the book. And I think this would be the perfect first book for you to ask our Aunt Lydia Book Club manager, Julie Carlucci, to send to someone that you want to give a really special Christmas to. And this will be archived. It's on Twitch. It'll be on for 2 weeks. I'm going to see if we can get a permanent archive because it can't just go away. It was such a great event. And oh, I forgot to tell you one other thing. This book is also available on audio. So if you know someone who enjoys audio or is like me, I read books, I love them, then I get the audio, but most people aren't that crazy. Book Passage and other independents have an arrangement with a group called Libro FM. And I know I looked on their site and they sell this audio. Their prices are about the same as the other people, but they don't invade your privacy the way the others do. And they make sure that the bookstore that you sign up through gets a commission each time you buy an audiobook. So please buy it in hardback, buy it in audio, come by, we'll gift wrap it for you, or we'll send it and you can send them a note and say, it's gonna come, just wait, you can read it for New Year's. Thank you both so very much and keep working on new things, both of you. I loved seeing the 2 of you together. I felt that I had snuck in.
Well, when things go back to normal, we'll get Jim out and the 3 of us will go hang out somewhere. So
absolutely. We'll hang out at the Book Passage Cafe.
Exactly.
Thanks so much to both of you and to all of you who are watching, and have a wonderful evening. Take care.
Thank you very much, Elaine. Thank you, Tom.
Thanks, Jim.